At my daughter's wedding, just as I reached for the chair they had set for me, the unthinkable happened. Before I could lower myself, her fiancé yanked it back. My body hit the polished marble floor with a crack that silenced the music and turned the laughter into uneasy gasps. For a moment the entire room froze, and then, as if on cue, faint chuckles spread from one table to another. And then came his words, sharp enough to slice through bone, cold enough to pierce deeper than the fall itself. "Your place is on the floor." I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I didn't give him the satisfaction of my anger. I just looked up at him, every muscle in my 6'2" body aching, every memory of the years I carried my daughter Emily alone burning behind my eyes. Humiliation pressed down on my chest like a weight I could barely hold, but alongside it came something else, restraint. Because I knew in that moment this wasn't just about a chair. It was about dignity. And before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Your support helps us keep bringing you powerful stories like this one. I braced one hand against the cold marble and the other on the edge of the tablecloth, pulling myself up slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands when life has knocked him down more times than anyone ever should endure. But before I could fully rise, a sound cut through the tension, the heavy, deliberate thud of boots crossing the marble floor. I turned, expecting another insult, but what I saw instead changed everything. A man had just arrived late to the ceremony, his suit immaculate, but his posture giving him away, shoulders squared like a soldier, stride steady, purpose carved into each step. His eyes found mine instantly, and his face drained of color as though he'd seen a ghost rise from the ground. "Sir, is that you?" he whispered, barely breathing. And in that fragile silence, the entire wedding shifted. Heads turned, whispers died. Even the string quartet lowered their bows mid-note. Emily, my daughter, stood frozen at the altar, her bouquet trembling in her hands, roses spilling petals like broken promises across the aisle. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes locked on mine, filled with confusion and shame, the beginning of an unspoken war between love and loyalty flickering behind them. I saw her dreams, the fairy tale wedding she imagined, the life she thought she was walking into, begin to fracture right there before me. Across the room, Ryan Carter, the man who had just humiliated me, stood tall and smug, his lips curling with disdain as though my pain confirmed his power. He thought this was victory. He thought this was strength. But he didn't know me. He didn't know the years I spent rebuilding a life from the ground up after Laura, my late wife, passed. He didn't know the promises I had made over a hospital bed, whispering to her that I would protect Emily with everything I had. And he certainly didn't know the battles I had already survived. Battles fought in deserts half a world away, carrying brothers through fire, bleeding but unbroken. Ryan believed he'd put me on the floor. He didn't realize he had just set something much larger into motion, something no one in that room, not even me, could stop. Under the frozen weight of that moment, I steadied myself, forcing my legs to hold beneath me as the hush of the room deepened. My palms still burned from the marble's cold bite, but the heat rising beneath my skin was stronger than the pain. Across the aisle, Emily's bouquet slipped in her hands, petals falling silently like quiet confessions. Her wide eyes locked on me, silently asking what she could not speak aloud. She had dreamed of this day, dreamed of walking into a future she thought she had chosen, a future she believed was safe. But standing there, staring at the man she loved and the father she trusted, she could feel the foundations begin to shift beneath her feet. My gaze softened when it met hers, though inside me a storm roared louder than the soft murmurs creeping through the crowd. I wanted her to see strength where there had been humiliation, calm where anger threatened to rise, because no matter how deeply Ryan Carter wanted to reduce me to nothing, I refused to let my daughter see me break. Ryan stood a few feet away, his hand still on the back of the chair he'd ripped from under me, his lips curling in a smirk he hadn't yet learned to hide. To him, this wasn't cruelty, it was sport. He believed that my silence, my steady rise from the floor, was surrender. He didn't know better. He didn't know that silence can be louder than shouts, that composure can burn hotter than rage. He didn't know that every scar etched into my hands told a story of battles survived, battles far harsher than his petty games. And then the boots moved again. The late arrival stepped closer, his movements measured, his presence commanding the air around him without effort. His tie sat slightly crooked against the pressed charcoal of his jacket, but it didn't matter. Everything about him radiated discipline. The squared shoulders, the soldier's stride, the sharp alertness carved deep into the lines of his face. He stopped only a breath away, his gaze steady, locked on mine like a man who had just found the missing piece of a story he thought he'd left behind decades ago. His voice came rough, cracked with disbelief, but steady enough to carry through the silence. "Sergeant Miller, it really is you." The name hit me like thunder. A weight from another life, a name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly 2 decades. Memories slammed into me all at once. 2005. Iraq. The rattle of gunfire in the dead of night, burning smoke thick in my lungs, sand and sweat mixing with blood beneath my boots. I saw flashes of a convoy under ambush, shadows moving between bursts of fire, brothers falling, and him, Richard Carter, pinned under wreckage, screaming orders hoarse until his voice was swallowed by the roar of flames. I remembered hauling him up onto my shoulders, carrying his weight step after agonizing step, 250 yards under fire, refusing to let go, refusing to let him die. And now here he stood, decades older, grayer, breathing the air I helped him keep, staring at me like a man who had just been pulled from death all over again. The room was silent, though not from shame anymore. Not laughter now, not whispers. It was the kind of silence people hold when history unfolds in front of them. Emily's lips parted, confusion etched into every soft line of her face as she glanced between us, unable to piece together how her father's past had just stepped into her present. Ryan's expression faltered too, though he tried to mask it, shifting uncomfortably in a suit that suddenly seemed far too big for him. Richard straightened his posture further, commanding the space without trying, his voice deeper this time, carrying over the strings still frozen mid-bow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, turning so his words reached every table in the grand hall, "this man, David Miller, saved my life." He paused, letting the words settle, heavy and irreversible. 2005, Iraq. I was left for dead in the middle of an ambush, and this man carried me through fire, through hell itself, refusing to let me go when everyone else had given up. Gasps rippled through the guests, but Richard wasn't finished. His hand, trembling slightly despite his composure, gestured toward me with reverence. "Without him, I wouldn't be here today. Without him, my son wouldn't be here. This family, my family, owes its existence to this man." He stepped forward, placing a hand firmly on my shoulder, a soldier's grip, steady and unyielding. "And I will not stand by while anyone dishonors him." All eyes shifted toward Ryan. For the first time since I'd met him, his confident armor cracked. His lips parted, but no words came. His jaw clenched, shoulders tightened, and his gaze dropped under the weight of his father's stare. Emily's trembling hand touched my arm lightly, her knuckles pale, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths, as if she were only now beginning to realize the man she thought she knew was a stranger. Around us, the chandeliers glimmered softly against the quiet, and I felt my own breath steady, though my heart still pounded with memory, with gratitude, with the rush of justice rising quietly but powerfully in the room. But I stayed silent. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any condemnation. I let Richard's words ripple through the guests, let the truth dismantle Ryan's facade piece by piece until there was nothing left for him to hide behind. Even the string quartet, their bows frozen mid-air, seemed unwilling to breathe until the weight of the moment had settled fully into the floor beneath us. Emily turned toward Ryan slowly, her face pale, her lips trembling, but her eyes sharp, searching his for some sliver of remorse, some crack where sincerity might slip through. Instead, she found only the flicker of frustration behind his clenched jaw, the barely concealed resentment at being exposed. Her chest rose with a shaky breath, tears gathering but not falling, and I could see her shoulders straighten as though somewhere inside her a choice was beginning to take shape. Ryan tried to recover, to salvage control. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low, but carrying in the silence. I didn't realize who he was. Richard's head turned sharply, his gaze narrowing like the edge of a blade. "You didn't need to know who he was, Ryan. You just needed to know he is her father. And respect should not require history to be earned." There it was, the knife twisted, clean and deliberate. Murmurs spread across the tables, not cruel this time, but heavy with judgment. Words like simple man and humiliation carried differently now, transformed from jokes into echoes of shame, but they weren't mine to bear anymore. For the first time in a long while, the weight shifted off my shoulders, and in its place came something else entirely clarity. Emily's gaze stayed on Ryan, and I could almost see the walls she had built for him begin to fracture. She thought she'd seen the man beneath the charm, thought she understood his ambition, his hunger for more than life in Brooklyn could offer. But now, under the light of a father's quiet endurance, and the unexpected reverence of the man Ryan called his own, she could see the truth unmasked. It wasn't ambition, it was arrogance, it wasn't strength, it was fear. I wanted to reach for her, but I held back, because this choice, the one she didn't yet know she was making, had to be hers. I wouldn't force it. I wouldn't rescue her from her own heart, no matter how much I wanted to. I had carried her through scraped knees, heartbreaks, sleepless nights filled with whispered promises to Laura that I'd protect her always. But this wasn't a battle I could fight for her. This was the kind of fight you win by stepping back, by letting the weight of truth do what no argument ever could. And so I stood steady, my chest rising with quiet breaths, letting the silence stretch until it filled every corner of the room. Outside, beyond the arched windows, the city moved on traffic lights blinking, horns blaring in the distance, spring winds stirring the blossoms that lined the garden. Inside, though, time seemed suspended, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable break in the tension. It would come, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Beneath the crystal chandeliers, time held its breath as Emily's trembling fingers tightened around the bouquet, the roses bruised where her grip had crushed them. The hush in the hall was heavy, almost unnatural, as if the walls themselves were straining to hear what would happen next. Ryan Carter stood only a few steps away, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched, his carefully rehearsed mask of control slipping like melting wax under the weight of his father's words. Richard Carter's hand remained firm on my shoulder, a soldier's touch, not gentle, not commanding, but grounding, like the acknowledgement of something unspoken between men who had carried each other's lives once upon a time. The guests, dressed in satin and polished shoes, stared with wide, uneasy eyes, their champagne untouched, the music still frozen mid-breath. Some whispered quietly, though the words carried, spreading the revelation like sparks leaping from table to table. Sergeant David Miller saved Richard Carter's life. The name hung in the air, rewriting the story Ryan had tried to craft about me, about us. Ryan's gaze finally shifted, darting between his father, Emily, and me, his lips parting slightly as if words might rescue him, but nothing came out. His confidence, the thing he wore like armor, cracked in the silence, and when Emily turned her tear-bright eyes on him, I could see the beginning of something changing inside her. "Ryan," she whispered, soft but unsteady, her voice cracking like a thin branch beneath weight. Her tone was not angry, not yet. It was questioning, searching, as though she needed him to give her something, an explanation, an apology, anything real enough to hold on to. But Ryan's pride, the very thing that had driven every choice until now, wouldn't let him bend. "I didn't know," he muttered finally, low and hoarse, his voice reaching only as far as the nearest table. Then louder, strained. "I didn't know who he was." Richard turned his head slowly, his gaze sharp and unyielding, cutting through Ryan's words like steel slicing rope. "You didn't need to know who he was," his father said, his voice steady but trembling faintly beneath its control. "You just needed to know he is Emily's father. That was always enough." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward in silence first, then into hushed murmurs. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Others avoided meeting anyone's gaze, as though politeness could erase what they had just witnessed. But there was no erasing this, not anymore. Emily's breaths came shallow and uneven, her chest rising and falling as though she couldn't find steady ground beneath her. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between the man she thought she loved and the reality now unraveling around her. She looked at Ryan, waiting, pleading silently for the man she wanted him to be, to show himself, just once. But Ryan didn't. He straightened slightly, shoulders rigid, choosing arrogance over vulnerability, control over compassion. "I was nervous," he said tightly, the excuse scraping through his teeth like gravel. "It was a joke." Everyone laughed. "No," Emily said suddenly, her voice breaking in its quiet firmness. She shook her head, roses trembling in her hands, petals falling to the polished floor. Not everyone. The weight of her words landed hard. Ryan's jaw worked as though he wanted to respond, but the silence she left him offered nowhere to hide. Richard's hand slipped from my shoulder at last, but his eyes remained locked on his son, disappointment carved deeply into the hard lines of his face. I remained still, silent, letting Emily's realization take its course. There are moments in life when a parent's instinct screams to step in, to shield, to rescue. But this wasn't mine to fight. My promise to Laura to protect our daughter meant more than putting myself between Emily and pain. It meant giving her the strength to face it herself, to see clearly, to choose for herself what her worth was. The officiant, who had stood awkwardly frozen behind the microphone, finally cleared his throat, shuffling his notes with trembling hands. "Perhaps," he began, his voice faltering before gathering faint strength. "Perhaps we should take a short break." But no one moved. The air in the hall had thickened, charged with something unspoken but undeniable. A reckoning was unfolding, and no one dared interrupt it. Emily's fingers loosened on the bouquet until it slipped from her grasp entirely, roses scattering across the marble like a soft surrender. She stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking softly against the floor, closing the space between her and Ryan. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried through the silence anyway. "Do you respect my father?" Ryan blinked, his throat working around a reply he wasn't prepared to give. "Emily," he said finally, reaching for her hand, but she pulled back before his fingers could touch hers. "Do you?" she repeated, firmer this time, her voice steadying even as tears threatened to spill. Ryan hesitated too long. That pause, that beat of silence, answered her more honestly than words ever could. "And Emily, my daughter, the little girl who used to crawl into my lap with scraped knees and trembling shoulders, the woman who had dreamed of this day since she was 16, began to see." She turned her head toward me briefly, her lips parting as though to ask for guidance, but I said nothing. I held her gaze steady, unshaken, and offered only the smallest nod, a reminder that her strength was her own, that she had always had it. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, waiting for the moment to break, but it didn't. Ryan stepped back half a pace, his composure unraveling thread by thread, and the silence made his downfall all the louder. He turned slightly toward the guests, forcing a laugh that came out brittle and hollow. "We're fine," he said quickly, almost too quickly, trying to regain the charm he wielded so effortlessly before. "A little family misunderstanding, that's all." But no one believed him. Not after Richard Carter had stood in front of hundreds of people and declared his son's betrayal not just of me, but of the values he thought he had raised him to honor. I reached for the edge of the table beside me, steadying myself, not from weakness, but from something deeper, the weight of the past crashing headlong into the present. The war, the promises, the years of quiet work, rebuilding a life for Emily, all leading here, to this single breath where truth could no longer be ignored. Ryan looked at me finally, his gaze sharp, almost pleading, though pride wouldn't let him show it. And for the first time I saw something behind his carefully sculpted mask. Fear. Not fear of me, but fear of exposure, of the facade collapsing. He wanted control, wanted the room to believe he was still the man holding all the power, but everyone could see it now, the emperor without his crown. Then, softly but firmly, I spoke for the first time since the chair had been pulled from under me, since Richard had revealed what Ryan didn't know. Respect isn't about history, Ryan. It's not earned by medals or money or pulling someone off a battlefield. It's earned every day, in how you treat people, especially the ones you claim to love. The words landed heavy in the space between us, and I could feel them ripple outward like quiet thunder. Emily's shoulders squared almost imperceptibly beside me, her chin lifting just enough to signal something shifting deep within her. The decision hadn't been made yet, but the path toward it had begun. Across the room I noticed Linda Carter, Ryan's aunt, seated quietly at a table near the wall. Her face, usually composed and neutral at events like this, now carried something heavier, as though she, too, carried a piece of truth she had been waiting to speak. But not yet. Not here. The music had long since died, the laughter stilled, and though the world outside Eternal Gardens kept moving, cars honking, traffic lights changing, a breeze bending the blossoms in the courtyard inside this room. Something irreversible had taken root. I looked at Emily again, and she looked at me, and for a brief moment, despite the chaos swirling silently around us, there was clarity in her eyes. Not peace yet, not closure, but the first glimmer of seeing things as they were, not as she had hoped them to be. What I didn't know then was that this was only the beginning. The night after the wedding rehearsal, I sat alone in my garage, the smell of grease and cold steel hanging heavy in the air, trying to make sense of the storm unraveling around us. The Harley's chrome glinted beneath the single dangling bulb, and Maria's photograph on the wall watched me like a silent witness. My hands rested against the workbench, still stained from years of turning wrenches, hands that had built a life bolt by bolt, and yet now trembled beneath a weight no machine had ever placed on me. Outside, the hum of Brooklyn settled into a soft rhythm, distant laughter from a neighbor's porch, the muted roar of a subway beneath the street. But inside, the quiet felt louder than any chaos. I kept hearing Richard Carter's voice echoing in my head, his public declaration still reverberating like a bell I couldn't unring. This man saved my life. It had flipped the entire room upside down. It shifted the spotlight, shattered the narrative Ryan had carefully built around me. The simple man, the mechanic, the father to be tolerated rather than respected. But I also knew men like Ryan. Humiliation doesn't soften them, it hardens them. And deep down, I sensed that night had only been a beginning, not an ending. I wasn't wrong. It was just after midnight when the pounding came. 3 heavy, deliberate knocks against the front door. Not uncertain, not polite, but sharp enough to rattle the frame. My pulse quickened as I wiped my hands on an old rag and walked toward the sound, each step slow, steady, deliberate. Through the glass panel I saw him. Ryan Carter, his perfectly tailored coat thrown carelessly over his shoulders, his face flushed, his expression somewhere between rage and desperation. I opened the door but said nothing, letting the silence hang like a drawn weapon. He stepped inside without invitation, his cologne mixing sharply with the faint smell of oil and dust that clung to my house. His polished shoes struck the hardwood with sharp, controlled clicks as he paced the living room, glancing briefly at Maria's framed photo on the mantel before settling his glare on me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but vibrating with tension. I leaned casually against the doorframe, arms folded, my silence forcing him to carry the weight of his own urgency. "You've been poisoning her against me," he accused, stabbing a finger toward me, the words spilling out faster than he could temper them. "Emily's different since the dinner. She's asking questions. She's doubting me. And we both know why." I raised an eyebrow, calm and measured. "Poisoning her," I repeated softly. "Or showing her who you really are?" His jaw tightened, his breath harsh. "You think you're clever, don't you? You sit there in your little garage, pretending to be noble, pretending you're better than me." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a growl. "Tomorrow you're going to call her. You're going to tell her you were wrong about me, that you overreacted. You're going to fix this mess you've created, or—" I cut him off, my tone even, my voice barely above a whisper, but sharper than steel. "Or what?" The question hung between us like a lit fuse, daring him to finish it. Ryan's face flushed deeper, his perfect composure cracking under the weight of my stillness. He hesitated, then blurted out, "Or you'll lose her. You'll lose your daughter for good. Of." I stared at him, unmoving, my hands relaxed but steady, and for the first time I saw it clearly. This wasn't strength. This was fear. This was a man so desperate to hold control, he didn't see it slipping through his fingers with every word he spoke. "Young man," I said finally, my voice low, unshaken, "you're standing in my house, threatening the only family I have left. I think you should leave before you regret what comes out of your mouth next." "Oh?" Something in my tone landed where my silence hadn't, because for the first time that night, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But pride is a stubborn thing, and Ryan clung to it like a lifeline. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he spat, trying to reclaim ground he'd already lost. I stepped forward, just slightly, not aggressive, just close enough for him to feel the steadiness in me. "Actually," I said softly, "I think I do." The silence between us stretched long enough for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen to sound deafening. Finally, Ryan broke, spinning on his heel and storming toward the door. He yanked it open, but before stepping into the night, he turned back one last time, his voice sharp, ragged. "This isn't over, David. She's mine. She chose me." I met his glare without flinching. "Emily isn't property," I said evenly. "She doesn't belong to anyone." The door slammed hard enough to rattle the frames on the walls, and then his car engine roared down the street until the sound dissolved into the distance. The house settled back into its familiar creaks and quiet, but I knew the silence had changed. A line had been drawn. The next morning, I drove to Emily's apartment, the city already awake with honking taxis and hurried footsteps on crowded sidewalks. Her building, all glass and steel rising into the Manhattan sky, stood in stark contrast to my block in Brooklyn, where mismatched shutters and uneven porch steps told stories of families who built their lives nail by nail. I knocked softly, and when she opened the door, I knew immediately she hadn't slept. Her eyes were rimmed red, her shoulders hunched, but she managed a small, tired smile when she saw me. "Dad," she breathed, her voice fragile. I stepped inside, the apartment spotless and silent, too perfectly arranged to feel like home. She led me to the couch and curled her legs beneath her, the same way she used to when she was a little girl, tucking herself into small spaces when the world felt too big. "He came by last night, didn't he?" she asked quietly. I nodded. Her lips pressed together, trembling faintly, and she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I love him, Dad. But—" her voice cracked and she shook her head slowly, as though the words were too heavy to carry. "I don't like who I'm becoming with him." I reached for her hand, rough against her soft fingers, and held it gently. "Emily," I said softly, "love doesn't demand that you make yourself small, and anyone who truly loves you will never try to diminish the people you love." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded faintly, the truth carving its way quietly into her heart. She leaned against me, her head on my shoulder, the weight of her uncertainty pressing heavy between us. That afternoon the whispers began. First from a neighbor outside the hardware store, his voice cautious, almost apologetic. I heard Ryan downtown, bragging about moving Emily out of Brooklyn for good, said it was like trading up from a used car. I thanked him, said nothing, but the words settled like stones in my chest. Then Mrs. Rodriguez from the bakery whispered while handing me my usual loaf. I overheard him at a cafe near her office. He said Brooklyn's the kind of place people grow out of. Each whisper chipped away at the image Emily had painted for herself, the version of Ryan she wanted to believe in. And just when I thought I had heard enough, the final blow came one gray morning as I sat idling at a red light in Midtown. There he was, Ryan Carter, standing outside a glass tower, phone pressed to his ear, his hand slicing the air with casual confidence. I wasn't trying to listen, but his voice carried sharp and clear. "She's perfect," he said, his tone smooth, calculated. Sweet, trusting. And her father? He's exactly what we needed, a simple man, someone who won't interfere. She's an acquisition, Mark, that's all. A step toward the life I want. The light turned green, but I didn't move. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles went pale, the word acquisition echoing like gunfire in my chest. That night, back in the garage, I sat in the dim glow beneath the single bulb, staring at Maria's photo, whispering into the quiet. "I promised you I'd protect her," I said softly, my voice rough. "And I will." I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Mark Stevens, an old friend from Iraq turned lawyer. When he picked up, his voice carried the same steady calm I remembered from the nights when we'd shared silence under desert skies. Within an hour, we met at the corner bar, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the wet pavement. Over 2 cups of bitter coffee, I told him everything. The humiliation, the threats, the whispers, the phone call, the word that wouldn't leave me. He listened carefully, storing every detail the way he always had. Soldier first, strategist second. When I finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Men like Ryan," he said quietly, "they burn themselves out. You don't swing at them, you wait. You watch. And when the time comes, you let the truth speak for itself." I nodded, steadying my breath. "And if she doesn't see it until it's too late?" "Then you catch her when she falls," Mark replied simply. I thought of Emily's tired eyes, her trembling hands, the bouquet slipping from her grasp under those crystal chandeliers, and I knew then the time for patience was nearly over. The morning of the wedding broke sharp and bright, the kind of April day when the sky looks scrubbed clean, as though the city itself is bracing for something inevitable. I woke before dawn, the tick of the old clock in the living room suddenly unbearable, each passing second pulling me closer to a moment I wasn't sure any of us were ready for. I turned the hands back to silence it and stood there for a long while, staring at Maria's photograph above the mantel. Her smile, frozen in time, felt like both a comfort and a weight, reminding me of the promise I had made long ago to protect Emily, always. I slipped into my navy suit, the one I'd worn to her college graduation, and the dinner where Ryan Carter tried to humiliate me. The fabric was worn, the seams pressed thin from years of service, but I chose it deliberately, not to impress but to stand steady. This wasn't about appearances. It was about dignity. By noon, Eternal Gardens was alive with motion. Rows of white chairs stretched across manicured lawns, under towering arches of roses heavy with blossoms. Crystal chandeliers inside the reception hall glimmered under sunlight that poured through massive glass windows, scattering light like fractured stars. Guests dressed like jewels milled in small clusters, champagne flutes catching flashes of gold as they exchanged polite, hollow laughter. I kept to the edges, invisible by choice, a mechanic in a world of polished financiers, walking through it like a ghost. And then Emily appeared. She stepped into view at the aisle, radiant in the altered lace gown that had once belonged to her mother. For a moment time bent inward, and I saw Maria the same neckline, the same soft fabric, and the same quiet strength stitched into every delicate detail. My throat tightened painfully. Pride swelled heavy in my chest, tangled with something darker, something unspoken, because even as I watched my daughter, my little girl, step into her future, I knew the ground beneath her feet wasn't steady. The ceremony began. The officiant's voice soft and rehearsed, but I barely heard the words. My focus was on Emily's trembling hands, on the faint tension in her shoulders, on the way her gaze drifted to Ryan but didn't linger. The vows were exchanged, but her voice faltered twice. The kiss was brief, polite, applause controlled, rehearsed, and then came the reception. The ballroom was a cathedral of opulence, white linen tables, towering centerpieces, silver cutlery polished so sharply it caught reflections like mirrors. I found my place card, table 14, tucked neatly between strangers and an elderly aunt I didn't know. That wasn't an accident. Ryan had placed me there, far from Emily, far from the head table, far from relevance, but I'd survived worse than isolation. I sat quietly, eating little, drinking less, nodding politely when spoken to, my eyes scanning the room without appearing to. Ryan, at the center of it all, basked in the glow of charm he'd mastered so well, leaning in close to laugh with executives, clinking glasses with ease, every motion calculated for effect. To everyone watching, he looked like the perfect groom, the perfect host, but I'd seen the other Ryan, the one who called Emily an acquisition, who threatened me in my own living room, who believed respect was something bought, not earned. And I knew it was only a matter of time before his mask slipped again. It happened faster than I expected. During the speeches, I rose from my chair at table 14 when another guest waved me over to share a story about Emily as a little girl. I reached for my chair to push it under the table, but before I could, it vanished beneath me. My body pitched backward, gravity ripping me toward the polished marble floor. There was a brief, stunned silence, the clink of glasses cut off. Conversations strangled mid-word, and then the sound of my back hitting the ground cracked through the room like a gunshot. Laughter followed, quiet at first, then spreading in small, uneasy ripples. I looked up from the cold floor, my breath slow, steady, deliberate, and saw Ryan standing above me, one hand still resting on the back of the chair he'd yanked away. His smile was thin, sharp, vicious beneath its practiced charm. "Oops," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "Looks like someone's a little unsteady on his feet. Age catches us all eventually, doesn't it?" A few scattered chuckles answered him, but they died quickly as faces turned pale under the weight of realization. Across the room, Emily's bouquet slipped from her hand, roses spilling onto the aisle, her sharp cry slicing through the hush. "Dad!" I stayed down longer than I needed to, not because I was hurt, but because I wanted the silence to deepen, to thicken, to force everyone in that pristine hall to sit with what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, deliberately, I braced my palm against the cold marble, pushing myself upright. My suit coat hung uneven, dust clinging to the fabric, but I stood tall anyway, because dignity isn't measured by how many times you're knocked down. It's measured by how you rise. The laughter stopped, the air stilled, the tension straining so tightly it hummed. And then boots. The sound cut across the marble like a heartbeat, steady, sharp, unhurried. At the entrance, Richard Carter stood, late to his son's wedding, his tie slightly askew, his suit immaculate, his presence commanding the room without effort. His gaze scanned the hall until his eyes landed on me, and then he froze. His color drained, his breath caught, his lips parted slightly. "Sergeant Miller?" he whispered, barely audible, but the silence carried it through the entire room. I turned fully toward him, my expression calm, steady, unbroken. Recognition flashed across his face, detonating like memory come to life. The guests shifted, confused, sensing the collision of past and present but not yet understanding. The string quartet lowered their bows mid-note, melodies dissolving into silence as Richard's voice rose louder this time, reverent and unshaken. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, stepping forward, "this man, David Miller, saved my life." Oh! The ballroom erupted in gasps, murmurs cascading like waves crashing against glass walls. Richard's hand trembled slightly as he gestured toward me, his voice thickening with memory. "In 2005, Iraq, I was left for dead during an ambush. David carried me 250 yards under fire, bullets cutting the air around us, flames closing in, refusing to leave me behind when everyone else thought I was gone. I am here today, alive, because of him. Without him, there would be no me. There would be no Ryan." All at once, the weight of his words rewrote everything. The whispers that had once mocked me, simple man, Brooklyn mechanic, transformed into reverence that swept the hall. Faces that had looked down on me just minutes ago now turned with something heavier in their gaze. Shame, gratitude, respect. And Ryan? Ryan stood frozen, his jaw tight, his grip on his champagne glass trembling just enough for the light to catch it. The mask was gone. For the first time, the carefully sculpted arrogance slipped, replaced by something raw and naked panic. Emily's tear-lined eyes darted between us, her chest rising and falling with sharp breaths, the truth unfolding faster than she could hold it. The man she thought she loved stood revealed in a way words never could. Richard moved closer, placing a hand firmly on my shoulder, his voice louder now, controlled but carrying the weight of command. "And this is how you treat him?" He turned toward his son, the room holding its breath. "The man who saved your father's life? The reason you're standing here today?" Ryan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stammered once, twice, swallowed hard, then finally whispered, "I didn't know." You didn't care to know," Richard snapped, his tone cutting sharper than glass. "Respect should never have required history to earn it." Gasps rippled again, followed by silence so profound the ticking clock above the bar filled the edges of the hall. Emily's trembling hands found the edge of the table near her, steadying herself as tears slipped free. I finally spoke, my voice calm, even, but carrying through every corner of the room. "Ryan wanted me on the floor. But men like me don't stay there. We rise. And when we rise, we don't do it to crush others. We rise to hold up the people we love." Emily stepped forward then, the strength returning to her shoulders, her chin lifting as though she carried the weight of both revelation and resolve. Her voice trembled, but the words cut cleanly through the silence. "Love doesn't look like what you've done, Ryan. Love doesn't humiliate. Love builds." Ryan reached for her hand instinctively, desperation flashing in his eyes, but Emily stepped back, shaking her head slowly. The diamond on her finger caught the chandelier's light as she slid the ring off, her movements deliberate, unhurried. Gasps rippled like thunder as she placed it gently on the table between them. "I choose dignity," she said softly but firmly. "I choose truth. I choose the life Mom and Dad taught me to honor." Ryan's lips parted, searching for words that no longer existed. His shoulders slumped, his world meticulously constructed, polished, perfected, collapsing beneath the weight of history, of truth, of the love he couldn't counterfeit. Emily stepped toward me then, her hand slipping into mine. Together, we stood not as bride and groom, but as father and daughter, taller than we'd ever stood in years. The hall erupted, not in applause for the wedding that had just dissolved, but for something deeper, a quiet, swelling respect, rising like a tide no one could hold back. Words like honor, hero, father, carried softly on the breath of the guests as we turned toward the doors, leaving behind chandeliers, polished marble, and the shattered facade of Ryan Carter's perfect life. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, the hum of the city alive around us. Emily's grip tightened in mine, her breath shaky but steadying, and for the first time in years, her voice sounded certain when she whispered, "Dad, you kept your promise." I looked up at the faint stars, barely visible beyond the city lights, and whispered back so softly only I and the memory of Maria could hear, "So did I." The days after the wedding unfolded like slow, deliberate breaths, each one carrying the weight of everything left unsaid inside that glittering ballroom. The city outside kept moving, oblivious to the storm we had just walked through, but for me and Emily, time seemed to bend, stretching quiet hours into moments thick with reflection. Back in Brooklyn, the rhythm of life returned as though nothing had changed. The soft creak of the front porch steps, the distant hum of buses groaning along Flatbush Avenue, kids shouting over stickball in the alley. But everything had changed. Emily spent the first 2 nights at my house. Her suitcases lined up neatly by the living room wall like quiet witnesses to the unraveling of a future she had believed in. She moved softly through the rooms, the scent of her faint perfume lingering like a reminder of Maria on certain mornings. I didn't press her to talk. I knew silence sometimes carries more strength than words ever could. We sat together on the porch most evenings, cups of black coffee cradled in our hands, watching the streetlights blink awake one by one as Brooklyn breathed into dusk. On the 3rd night she spoke. Her voice was soft at first, fragile but steady, the kind of voice a person finds when they've cried themselves dry and are finally left with only truths too stubborn to ignore. "I thought I knew him, Dad," she whispered, staring down into the dark swirl of her coffee. "I thought we were building a life together, but the whole time I was just a piece of his plan." Her lips trembled slightly, but her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, somewhere past the glow of our block, as though looking for pieces of herself scattered in the distance. I reached over, laying my calloused hand over hers, and she didn't pull away. "You gave your heart honestly, Emily," I said softly. "That's never a mistake. The mistake is thinking someone else's flaws belong to you." "Oh." She blinked, tears threatening, but they didn't fall this time. "Do you think I was blind?" I shook my head, letting the night wrap around us. "Number, you weren't blind, Princess. You were hopeful. And hope's not weakness. But it does ask for the truth eventually." For a long time we sat in silence again, the kind that doesn't suffocate but holds steady like a bridge between 2 hearts learning to breathe together again. The whispers about Ryan began to ripple through the city the way storms carry rain. News travels fast in Brooklyn, faster when pride and wealth collide. By the end of the week, it wasn't just our neighborhood murmuring. Manhattan boardrooms whispered too. Mark Stevens, my old friend, the lawyer, the man who had carried quiet steadiness through more battles than I could count, stopped by the garage one evening, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled high like old times. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and said in that unhurried voice of his, "Ryan Carter's mask didn't just slip, David. It shattered." I set down the wrench, wiped the oil from my palms onto a rag, and looked at him. "How bad?" Mark gave a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "Bad enough." The whispers about his acquisitions, his reckless spending, the financial mess he hid under polished shoes and champagne smiles, they're surfacing. People talk in this city, and they're talking loudly now. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just inevitability. Because men like Ryan, they build houses on sand, and no matter how high they climb, the tide always comes. For Emily's sake, I said nothing. The last thing I wanted was to let vindication taint healing. That wasn't what she needed now. What she needed was space room to understand her worth outside of anyone else's shadow. So I poured myself into the garage again. The Harley stood there, half-finished, chrome catching fractured sunlight through grimy windows. My hands remembered the motions long before my mind did. Wrench, tighten, wipe, test. The steady rhythm grounded me, just as it had after Maria passed, just as it had after nights when the world seemed intent on breaking me. It was honest work. Machines don't lie. They break, but they break openly. And when you fix them, they stay fixed. One late afternoon, Emily walked in without knocking, just like she used to when she was little. She stood in the doorway watching me for a long moment, her hair tied back, her eyes clearer than I'd seen them in weeks. Finally, she said, "You're almost done with it." I glanced at the Harley, the final pieces spread neatly across the bench, and nodded. Almost. She walked closer, trailing her fingers over the polished chrome, her reflection warped in its curve. "Mom would have loved this," she whispered. "She would have," I said softly. Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting from the bike to me. "I think I want to move back for a while," she said finally, her voice quiet but sure. "Not forever, just until I find my feet again." I set down the wrench and turned to her fully, seeing the strength slowly settling back into her bones. The faintest spark of the girl Maria and I raised the one who used to laugh loudest at our tiny kitchen table, who once believed that roses could grow through concrete just because we told her they could. "This is your home, Emily," I said simply. "It always has been." Her shoulders relaxed, just a little, and for the first time since the wedding, I saw something resembling peace cross her face. Over the weeks that followed, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Her laughter returned slowly, soft at first, then fuller, like sunlight stretching after winter. She filled the kitchen with the smell of cinnamon on Sunday mornings, painted her old bedroom walls a pale shade of blue, and left sketches scattered across the dining table like little pieces of hope rediscovered. And me? I kept working on the Harley. Some nights, Emily would sit cross-legged on the workbench, handing me tools like she did when she was 6, her small fingers gripping a wrench twice her size back then. We didn't always talk. We didn't need to. The silence between us had changed, no longer heavy, no longer burdened by what was lost, but softened by what was slowly returning. Then, one Friday evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Brooklyn rooftops, Richard Carter came by. I found him standing at the edge of the driveway, his hands clasped in front of him, the posture of a man who had rehearsed his words and still wasn't sure they'd be enough. The years had aged him, but his presence carried the same quiet authority it had that day in the ballroom when his voice broke the silence and shifted everything. "Mr. Carter," I greeted, wiping my hands on an old rag, ready for anything. He shook his head slightly. "Richard," he said, his voice calm but heavy with something I couldn't name. He stepped closer, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I owe you more than I can repay, David," he said quietly. "For my life, for standing up when my son failed to. But more than that, I'm sorry. For Ryan, for what he did, for what I didn't see soon enough." I studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "It's not my forgiveness you need," I said gently, glancing toward the house where Emily's shadow passed the kitchen window. He followed my gaze and nodded. "I know." We stood there in silence for a while, two fathers bound by a past neither of us had chosen, both carrying the weight of different kinds of promises. When he finally left, he pressed my hand firmly, the gratitude in his grip saying more than words ever could. That night, Emily sat beside me on the porch, our coffee mugs warming our hands against the spring chill. She rested her head on my shoulder, quiet, thoughtful. After a long silence, she whispered, "You kept your promise, Dad." I swallowed against the lump in my throat, squeezing her hand gently. "I did," I said softly. "And now it's your turn, Princess. Keep it for yourself. Protect the life you deserve. Build it your way, brick by brick." She nodded slowly, her breath deep and steady, and for the first time in months, I saw her shoulders lift, unburdened. Weeks later, the Harley was finished. The chrome gleamed under the morning sun as though it had been waiting all these years for this moment. I swung a leg over the seat, felt the engine rumble steady beneath me, and Emily leaned against the garage doorway, smiling the soft smile her mother used to wear when life found small ways to give itself back to us. "Take me for a ride?" she called out. I grinned, the sound of the engine filling the quiet block as I nodded. Always. And as we rode beneath the Brooklyn sky, streets winding beneath us, the wind tangling her laughter into the hum of the city, I felt the weight of the past lift, replaced by something lighter, not forgetting, not erasing, but carrying forward. Because sometimes keeping a promise isn't about holding someone else together. Sometimes it's about helping them find the strength to hold themselves. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. We both were. It had been 6 months since that night at Eternal Gardens, yet sometimes it still felt like I could hear the faint echo of chandeliers trembling, the sharp silence that followed Ryan Carter's fall, and Emily's quiet but steady voice choosing dignity over illusion. Seasons had shifted since then. Summer had stretched itself across Brooklyn, softening the edges of our neighborhood with long, golden evenings, kids laughing in the streets until the streetlights blinked awake. Time had moved forward, carrying us with it, but there were moments when I caught myself standing still, staring at Maria's photograph on the mantel, remembering the promise that had carried me through everything. Protect her. Always. Emily had stayed home longer than she planned. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that she just needed time to breathe. But as weeks turned into months, she discovered something unexpected, a quiet she hadn't realized she'd been craving. Life slowed here. Mornings began with the smell of fresh coffee and the chatter of birds nesting in the elm outside her window, not the rush of midtown traffic or the constant hum of ambition that had colored her days with Ryan. Evenings were softer, too. Sometimes we sat on the porch, sipping coffee as the heat of the day dissolved into cool breezes, saying little but understanding everything. Other nights she'd curl up on the couch, sketchbook balanced on her knees, filling page after page with lines and shapes, rediscovering the parts of herself she'd left behind in a city apartment, built more for appearances than for living. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It comes in pieces: a deep laugh at the kitchen table, a soft exhale when you realize the ache isn't constant anymore, a night when you finally sleep without waking from the weight of old memories. I watched her learn this slowly, patiently, the way you rebuild a home brick by brick after a storm tears it apart. But the world doesn't pause just because your heart needs time. Whispers about Ryan reached us now and then, carried quietly through the city like a current moving beneath the surface. Mark Stevens, ever the steady voice in the middle of chaos, came by one evening after closing the garage. We sat outside, while the sunset painted streaks of fire across the sky. "He's burned through almost everything," Mark said simply, tapping his fingers against his mug. "The firms pulled their backing. A couple of investments collapsed. Manhattan circles aren't as forgiving as they pretend to be." I nodded, letting his words settle. It wasn't triumph I felt, just inevitability. Men like Ryan live fast, climbing ladders built on fragile scaffolding, and when the weight of their own choices bears down, the fall is always louder than the rise. Emily, sitting nearby on the porch steps, listened quietly, her face unreadable in the amber light. After a while, she asked softly, "Do you think he's okay?" Mark and I exchanged a glance, and I shook my head slightly, choosing my words with care. "I think he's living with the choices he made," I said gently. "That's the only kind of justice that matters." She nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the chipped mug in her hands. And for the first time I saw not sadness but acceptance in her expression. In August, she signed a short-term lease on a little art studio above a bakery 2 blocks away. It wasn't much whitewashed walls, 2 tall windows that flooded the room with soft morning light, and shelves she filled with brushes, paints, and stacks of blank canvas. I helped her haul her easel up the narrow staircase one humid afternoon, my shirt sticking to my back while she laughed at my muttered complaints. When we set the last box down, she stood there for a long moment, her hands resting lightly on the wooden frame of the easel, and whispered, almost to herself, "It feels like mine." I smiled at her, seeing the spark I'd missed for so long, the one Maria used to carry, the one that had been buried beneath years of compromise and pretending. "That's because it is," I said quietly. From then on, the garage wasn't the only place in the neighborhood where work hummed into the night. Across the block, I'd see Emily's windows glowing, soft yellow against the dark, and I'd hear faint music drifting out when I walked the dog past her studio. Some nights, she came by late, streaks of paint on her forearms, leaning against the doorway with the same tired but content smile I remembered from her teenage years after long afternoons of practicing piano. And me? I finished the Harley. The day I tightened the last bolt, the engine roared to life beneath my hands, smooth and steady, and the sound carried out into the street like a promise kept. Emily came running from across the block, laughing as she clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the air. "Finally!" she shouted. "You've been working on that thing since I was 16. I grinned, wiping the sweat from my brow. "Some things," I said, glancing toward Maria's photo resting on the workbench, "are worth taking your time on." We took our first ride that weekend, the two of us winding through narrow Brooklyn streets, the late summer air rushing cool against our skin. Her laughter carried on the wind, and for a brief moment, the years fell away, the grief, the battles, the weight of promises replaced by something lighter, freer. When we pulled back into the driveway, Emily rested her hand over mine on the handlebar, her smile soft but steady. "You know," she said, her voice low, "I think I finally understand what Mom meant about choosing the life you build, not the one you're handed." I met her gaze, the same hazel eyes that had stared up at me when she was 6 years old, trusting me to keep her safe. "She'd be proud of you, Emily," I said, the words catching in my throat before I forced them out. "I know I am." Ugh. The wind carried the faint scent of jasmine from Mrs. Rodriguez's garden down the street, and the hum of the city blended into the quiet of our block, all the small, ordinary pieces falling back into place. That night, I stood on the porch long after Emily went inside, looking up at the faint stars barely visible beyond the city's glow. I touched the gold chain around my neck where Maria's ring rested, warm against my skin, and whispered into the soft, endless dark, "She's okay now." For the first time in years, I believed it. And maybe for the first time since losing her mother, so did she. It was early autumn when the air in Brooklyn began to shift, the heavy warmth of summer giving way to crisp mornings and quiet evenings scented faintly of wood smoke. 6 months had passed since the night everything changed, since Emily chose dignity over illusion beneath the chandeliers of eternal gardens, and yet the echoes of that moment still lingered like distant thunder. The city around us moved on, as it always does. But inside our little corner of Brooklyn, life was unfolding differently. Slower, softer, fuller. Emily's art studio above the bakery had become her sanctuary. Most mornings I'd pass by on my way to the garage and see the tall windows glowing faintly with early light, her silhouette framed against easels and canvas, hands moving in steady rhythm, as though each stroke pulled her closer to herself. She started selling her first pieces by late August. Small works at first, local galleries testing the waters, but soon they began to disappear as quickly as she could paint them. One evening she stopped by the garage, a roll of sketches tucked beneath her arm, her cheeks flushed from the autumn wind. "Dad," she said breathlessly, holding out a slip of paper, "I made my first real sale. 2 canvases, both gone." Her voice cracked on the last word, pride and disbelief tangled together. I wiped my hands on an old rag, smiling faintly as I studied her face, the same quiet determination Maria used to carry, that unshakable fire hidden beneath grace. "You didn't sell them," I said softly. "You earned them. That's different." Emily's smile deepened, tears glinting faintly before she blinked them away. "I'm starting to believe that," she whispered. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't just healing. She was becoming. But not all shadows fade at the same pace. Whispers about Ryan Carter still floated quietly through the city, carried like brittle leaves in the shifting wind. Mark Stevens came by one evening with updates I hadn't asked for but knew I needed to hear. We sat on the porch, coffee mugs warming our hands against the chill as the streetlights blinked awake. "It's worse than we thought," Mark said simply, his voice steady but low. "His deals fell apart. The firms pulled their backing. He's facing litigation over some bad investments he tried to bury." I stared at the cracked pavement beneath us, breathing slowly through the news. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, just inevitability, the quiet certainty of tides meeting the shore. Ryan had built his world on borrowed foundations, propping himself up with arrogance and charm, but the weight of truth always collects its debt. Emily stepped outside then, leaning against the porch rail, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands. She listened quietly, her gaze fixed on the fading orange horizon, and after a long silence she whispered, "I don't hate him, Dad." Mark glanced at her, then at me, before excusing himself softly, leaving us in the dim quiet of the block. I turned toward her, letting the silence stretch before answering. "You don't have to," I said gently. "Hate ties you to someone longer than they deserve." She nodded, her breath visible in the cooling air, and I saw the weight she'd been carrying finally begin to lift. I hope he learns," she murmured, almost to herself. "Maybe he will," I said. "But whether he does or not, that's not your burden anymore." That night, after Emily went inside, I lingered on the porch. The soft hum of traffic in the distance, the rustle of leaves shifting under a gentle breeze. I touched the chain around my neck, Maria's ring warm against my skin, and whispered into the stillness, "She's finding her way, Laura." And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a promise. They felt like the truth. In early October, Emily hosted her first small exhibition, a modest showing at a local gallery 2 blocks from the river. The night air was sharp as we walked through doors, framed by strings of dim white lights. Inside, her paintings hung on clean white walls, each one carrying fragments of the storm she'd endured and the quiet she'd rebuilt from the wreckage. Guests moved softly between them, murmuring low praise, glasses of wine in hand. I stood back, letting her shine, my hands tucked into the pockets of my worn suit, watching strangers see her the way I always had, resilient, unbroken, alive. And as I caught her laughing with a group of other artists, her cheeks flushed beneath the soft lights, I thought of the little girl she used to be, sitting cross-legged in the garage beside me, handing me wrenches she could barely lift, her tiny fingers smudged with oil and paint. By the end of the night, 3 pieces had sold. On the walk home, Emily slipped her arm through mine, leaning against me lightly, her laughter trailing into the quiet street. "I think I'm finally okay," she said softly, almost as though testing the words out loud for the first time. I squeezed her hand, my throat tightening, and nodded. "Yeah," I whispered, staring up at the pale slice of moon above the rooftops. "I think you are." And for the first time since losing Maria, I felt something I hadn't dared hold on to in years. Not just relief, not just peace, but the quiet, steady hum of hope. Because we had walked through fire, and somehow we were still standing, not broken, not bitter, but whole. Winter came quietly to Brooklyn, the kind that doesn't announce itself with storms but slips into the city on soft winds and gray skies. The streets grew quieter as the days shortened, and a thin layer of frost began to settle along the porch rails in the early mornings. 6 months had passed since Emily's first gallery showing, and though the cold had crept into the air, there was warmth here, now, the kind that doesn't come from heaters or blankets, but from the quiet rebuilding of a life once shaken to its foundation. The house felt different these days, lighter. The echoes that used to carry grief now held laughter again, soft and unhurried, like the creak of the stairs beneath bare feet or the clinking of mugs on the kitchen table. Emily spent most mornings in her studio, her tall windows glowing against the pale winter light, while I spent mine in the garage finishing smaller projects for neighbors who still trusted me with their stubborn engines. Life had settled into something steady, honest, and quietly full. Sometimes, though, the past would brush against the edges of the present in small, unexpected ways. One evening in December, just as the first snow began to fall, a letter arrived. It was from Richard Carter. His handwriting was neat but firm, the kind of script belonging to a man who had learned discipline long before comfort. Inside, his words were brief, almost sparse, but their weight pressed deeper than their length. "David, I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know Ryan left the city. He's starting over, far from here. I hope someday my son learns what it means to live with honor. Thank you, again, not just for my life, but for helping me see the truth when I couldn't. Richard." I read it twice, folded it carefully, and set it beside Maria's photograph on the mantel. For a long moment I stood there, letting the silence fill the room, letting the weight of all we had walked through finally feel distant, like thunder rolling far past the horizon. That weekend, Emily and I took the Harley out one last time before the snow settled in. The cold stung our faces, but the streets were quiet, almost reverent, the city pausing briefly between seasons. We wound through familiar blocks, past stoops lined with empty planters, past the bakery where she had first whispered her dreams of painting, past the park where Maria once laughed under summer skies bright with fireworks. When we reached the river, we stopped. The skyline stretched wide and endless across the gray water, the buildings catching fragments of fading light as the sun dipped low. Emily climbed off the bike and stood beside me, her breath curling into the crisp air. "Feels different now," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of everything behind us and the quiet hope of everything ahead. I nodded slowly, my hands resting on the handlebars, my gaze fixed on the horizon. "That's because it is," I said. "We made it here, Em. That's no small thing." She slipped her arm through mine and leaned her head against my shoulder. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" she asked quietly. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening, and placed my hand gently over hers. "She already is," I whispered. For a long time we stood there together, watching the city lights blink awake one by one, listening to the water lap softly against the shore. The cold wind stung our cheeks, but neither of us moved. In that stillness, I felt the weight of promises kept and the quiet strength of surviving what we once thought might break us. Later that night, as I placed Maria's ring back beneath my shirt, its warmth against my chest, I realized something I hadn't before. This wasn't the ending of anything. It was the beginning. Emily wasn't just rebuilding, we both were. And somewhere in that quiet, we'd found what we'd been missing for so long. Not revenge, not answers. Peace. Because sometimes keeping a promise isn't about holding on. It's about letting go, trusting the ones you love to find their way. And watching her now steady, sure, alive, I finally knew I had done just that. The house was still when we returned, the old clock ticking softly in the living room, each second carrying us forward, gently, into whatever came next. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the future. Life has a way of testing us, our patience, our strength, and the promises we make to the people we love. But through every storm, every heartbreak, and every quiet victory, one truth always remains. We rise by holding on to dignity, to hope, and to the bonds that matter most. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to show your support. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from and what moment stayed with you most. And if you believe in stories that remind us of resilience, love, and second chances, give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps us keep telling stories that truly matter.